Welcome to the Ethiopian Policy Institute. My name is Biruk Haregu, researcher in public policy and the political economy of developments in Africa. Today's program, I'll cover three topics related to the Ethiopian economy. The first is a resignation of the governor of Ethiopia's central bank. The second is on an issue myself and Dr. Muse Delaling discussed last week on the issue of economic mismanagement and policy misprioritization in Ethiopia. And the third, I want to share a recent interview conducted by a former minister and economic policymaker from Ethiopia. Dr. Arkebe Oqubay recently sat down with the Ugandan Development Bank to discuss manufacturing and industrial policy. During that conversation, he mentioned the Ethiopian experience quite extensively. So I want to share that video because there's much to learn from that sort of conversation. First topic I want to cover is the resignation of Mr. Mahmoud Miratu, governor of Ethiopia's central bank. Why would he leave at a time when the country is undergoing significant economic changes that he himself is spearheading? At the same time, what are potential implications that may be precipitated by him leaving office at this time? So the first question is, why now? And if the reform process, or so-called reform, that the regime speaks so much about is going according to plan, why would a key policymaker leave in the midst of so much uncertainty and without the job being done? That leads us to think that, first and foremost, the policy process isn't going according to plan. Both the policy prescription and the results aren't going well. They aren't going well for the Ethiopian economy. And more importantly, they aren't going well for the Ethiopian people. The other thing that we need to think about is that perhaps Mamo and others within key economic policy making roles are experiencing what many of us have been discussing and sharing, which is that policymakers need autonomy from political pressure. With the Ethiopian economy, specifically the central bank, one of the issues that has been discussed is a lack of policy autonomy for the bank. The executive or the prime minister often interferes in the workings of the central bank. For instance, it's well documented that Addis has made the central bank print money, which has precipitated inflationary pressure on the economy. One of the requisites of the IMF structural adjustment program was greater levels of autonomy for the central bank and the governor of the central bank. The last report that the IMF produced on this issue essentially said that the central bank does not have adequate autonomy. It doesn't make policy decisions without interference from the executive. And one of the things that we need to think about, and we will see in the days, weeks, and months ahead, is this the point of friction? Is Abiy Ahmed continuing to put undue pressure on Ethiopia's central bank? And as a new central bank governor is appointed, we'll see, will they resume the printing of money? Will they further lead to inflationary pressure on the economy? And was that the reason why Mahmoud ended up leaving the central bank? At the same time, we'll see the response of the IMF to this issue. The fact that one of its key central personnel is leaving at a time when the reform process is not complete. It's still highly tenuous, highly questionable as to what will happen with this process. As an individual, it's well known, who has worked with international financial institutions for many years and was essentially the central figure of this process. The fact that he's left will likely lead to significant repercussions when it comes to the International Monetary Fund and its response to this issue. So we'll have to wait and see. And so the question now is, what are some implications that may result from this? One of the things is that yet another clear indication that the so-called reform process isn't going according to how the regime would like us to believe. Propaganda is not what the reality is, or the perception that Abiy and his regime want to paint is not the reality on the ground. And the fact that a key personnel, perhaps the single most important individual in this process, and a front-facing figure, is leaving at a time when the reform process is not yet complete, it tells us things aren't going well. The other thing that we need to keep in mind, as I was alluding to earlier, is what kind of pressure will the Ethiopian Central Bank come under? Going forward, whoever is appointed as the next governor, how much pressure will they face from Abiy to interfere in the policy making process? How much political influence will seep into the central bank? And ultimately, we need to keep in mind, will the printing of money continue once again? And what kind of effect will that have on inflation and inflationary pressure? All that remains to be seen, but some of the key indicators suggest that we're headed in that direction. The lack of policy autonomy for key institutions, key individuals, bureaucrats is a huge hindrance, irrespective of whether they were implementing IMF policies, prescriptions, and structural adjustment programs or not. This kind of interference, political interference, and perhaps even political appointees to key strategic positions that ought to be made based on competence and merit will have significant detrimental impacts on the economy. We'll continue to monitor this situation. Second point that I want to touch upon is an argument that I've made for a number of years now, which is the Ethiopian economy is being mismanaged. If there's sort of a salient and central point that we can point to and we can see over the last several years, is economic mismanagement on the one hand and economic policy misprioritization on the other. As a consequence, we don't see any meaningful economic productivity. We don't see any meaningful changes in the structural imbalances that have weighed down the economy. And ultimately, we don't see any improvements in the lives and livelihoods of the Ethiopian people. Rather, what we see is increasing levels of poverty, increasing levels of inequality in income and wealth. And we also see that by and large, incomes are stagnant or real incomes are decreasing, and the cost of living for the vast majority of citizens has gotten out of hand and has become unbearable. So why is it that I have made this argument of economic mismanagement, and what could we point to show this mismanagement? First, I want to highlight that this is an argument that I've made in writing in an essay titled, "Is Abiy Ahmed Leading Ethiopia to Prosperity or Poverty?" I'll link that article in the description box of this video so folks can read it. Over the last 7 years, we've seen complete neglect of key economic sectors, particularly manufacturing has been neglected, industry and industrial policy has been neglected, and these are areas that Ethiopia has a comparative advantage in, and I'll highlight why that is. But before I make my case and argument, I want to highlight that the Ethiopian people themselves have said there's significant economic mismanagement. Afrobarometer, one of the preeminent public opinion organizations, they conduct surveys and polls across the African continent. They conducted a survey on the Ethiopian economy, comparing what the population thought of economic conditions in 2020 versus 2023. And in that public opinion poll, what we see is 72% of Ethiopians said the economy was being mismanaged. 72%. In addition, 85% of the population said the Abiy Ahmed regime was unable to control prices. In other words, they were unable to control inflation. 85% of the population says that regime cannot control inflation. 82% said that the regime has been unable to address income inequality. So the gap between rich and poor is increasing. 74% of the population says the Abiy Ahmed regime has been unable to create jobs. And 73% of the population said the regime has been unable to improve living standards. So over 70%, 72% up to 85%, based on specific questions, are saying the regime is mismanaging the economy. So an overwhelming majority of citizens believe that to be the case. Why is that? The point that myself and Dr. Musaidalaling made during our last program was that by and large, Ethiopia's economy is not being driven along comparative advantage. The concept of comparative advantage is really, really long-standing, and what I refer to is the notions of dynamic comparative advantage. Comparative advantage is essentially the idea that countries and economies produce the goods that they can produce at the cheapest price, and they engage in international trade. So essentially, through this process, each country produces what they can produce cheaply, they manufacture what they can produce cheaply, engage in international trade so that everyone is better off. At least so says the theory. But what we know is that this comparative advantage is a dynamic process. You can't be stuck on the lower rung of global value chains. If you can only produce agricultural goods, coffee, for instance, and you're only exporting coffee, you will be mired in poverty. You need to upgrade your production. You need to move up along the global value chains, increasingly produce more sophisticated goods and services so that your society can become wealthier. And so this notion of the dynamism of the comparative advantage concept is really, really important. It's not a static process, it's a dynamic process. And part of the role of the state, particularly for developing countries, through models such as the developmental state model, is to engage in discovery of comparative advantage, to continue to utilize industrial policy to ensure that their economies are able to produce increasingly more sophisticated goods and services. And so for Ethiopia, fundamentally, at this stage of development, if we were to say, what is our comparative advantage? It's going to be in manufacturing, agro-processing, and in some industrial goods. We say that because Ethiopia has a comparative advantage in the cost of labor. Ethiopia has a significantly large population. Roughly now it's estimated at about 130, 135 million. Of that, roughly 45% of the population is under the age of 15. Essentially half the population is under the age of 15, so just entering sort of working age. And then if we look at those under the age of 30, that is 71% of the population. So a significant sort of young population that's ready to be put to work. And as a consequence, the cost of labor in Ethiopia is cheaper relative to its neighbors and other countries and economies. This can be utilized by investing wisely in key economic sectors that require a large number of labor. So labor-intensive production and productivity, for instance, the Industrial Parks Program or Special Economic Zones Program that was instituted was an attempt to utilize this advantage, being able to take the working age population, put them in employment opportunities in these industrial parks in an array of areas, whether it's in the production of goods, whether it's in the management, whether it's in administration, etc. But there's an opportunity to utilize this comparative advantage to attract foreign direct investments, multinational companies, and as well as domestic firms, to incentivize them to hire this labor through a manufacturing-led development process. And this was adequately implemented. It was yielding significant results, but we have by and large strayed away from this policy and this comparative advantage. Rather, the focus and the shift has been towards tourism. At least that's what Abiy Ahmed and his regime are saying, but tourism in sort of niche markets, in resorts, in lodges. So the regime has been actively involved in the vanity endeavors, which by and large don't employ many people. It doesn't precipitate productivity process for the economy. And ultimately, there isn't much linkages between industries as a result of this kind of policy approach. In addition to that, of course, there's the construction of palaces across both for the Abiy Ahmed regime, as well as president of the Oromian region. They're building palaces around and on the outskirts of Addis Ababa, estimated to cost in total close to $20 billion. This kind of resource ought to be invested in strategically important sectors, again, manufacturing, industrial upgrading, but rather they're being used in really unproductive vanity projects. And so, as a consequence, capital is being squandered. The other area that the Abiy Ahmed regime has emphasized is mining. Mining has really, for all intents and purposes, hasn't come online. We haven't seen a significant influx of mining to the extent that we've seen some marginal gains. It's been in the mining of gold, but that was because much of the mining of gold had stopped because of civil war, particularly affecting the Tigray region. So there's been a bit of an increase in gold mining and then exporting it. And because the international prices for gold has increased in recent months, there's a little bit of an uptick in the exporting of gold. But as far as new minerals, new resources, we haven't seen anything meaningful. If anything, the regime had spoken about discovering petroleum, which we have never seen, and other mining projects and contracts which have been signed haven't come online to date. So it's really quite perplexing. Beyond all of that, mining is a capital intensive industry, meaning it requires a lot of course, financial capital to get started, but it also utilizes machines and equipment much more so than labor. And of course, Ethiopia's comparative advantage because of its youth bulge, its large population is in labor intensive production. So there's sort of it's incongruent. There is a contradiction in the policy approaches they're taking and where they ought to be. So when we add all that up, it becomes really, really clear that rather than focusing on an area that had been put into practice, the policy agenda had been set, much of the infrastructure had been provided in the form of industrial parks, special economic zones. Rail systems had been built or were being built quite effectively. Road systems were being effectively built. Electricity is coming online with projects such as the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam coming to conclusion. Part of the agenda with GERD and other hydroelectric dams being built throughout Ethiopia was that they would help further propel Ethiopia's manufacturing sector and its industrial upgrading. So rather than investing again in this really, really important, well thought out, well integrated program, the Abiy regime has completely gone in a different direction, which doesn't make sense, which is really a misprioritization and a misallocation of resources. And as a consequence, we haven't seen any meaningful transformation of the economy. And really, we won't see any transformation of Ethiopia's economy as long as this regime continues to do what it's doing. Rather than seeing economic gains and transformation, the Ethiopian economy will continue to go backwards. And key socioeconomic indicators, which I'll touch on a little bit later, will continue to worsen, unfortunately. So this is where we are, broadly speaking, in terms of the policy, the economic policy ecosystem. Again, not adhering to dynamic comparative advantage, not building upon the strategically oriented projects and programs of the last decade, 10 to 20 years in the making. And all of a sudden in 2018, Abiy Ahmed has gone completely wayward. And some of that obviously is linked to political decisions and the desire not to continue the policy agenda of the previous administration. But that means that the country and its people suffer as a consequence. A point that I've made both in writing and certain talks that I've given is that the World Bank did an impact evaluation on Ethiopia's industrial parks program. And by and large, that report concluded that Ethiopia's industrial parks program was delivering the objectives, delivering the goals that it was intended to deliver. It was broadly a well-functioning, well-implemented program, and some of the headwinds that it was facing were relatively easy to correct. It was by and large an issue. After Abiy Ahmed had come into power, they took a look at the program and the project again. Some of the points that they made was that there has been a lack of attention to the program, and there needed to be more political will and an emphasis on the special economic zones program to ensure that the gains won't be lost and the significant amounts of investment that have been made into this program aren't lost, but that hasn't been heeded. And so even the impact evaluations of sort of independent organizations have spoken to the vitality, the importance, and the effectiveness, the efficacy of the program. But unfortunately, the Abiy regime has decided to completely neglect this initiative. And so when we think about economic development policy making, there are two schools of thought that I want to quickly touch upon because they're really, really, really important to Ethiopia's current context. The first that was central to Ethiopia's economic policy making over the last 10 to perhaps 20 years is the developmental state model. This idea that the state can be an activist agent within the economy, and it does that by and large through industrial policy by providing strategic sectors, strategic industries, and even firms with a strategic support so that they're able to develop, they're able to become much more competitive and deliver economic gains to society. So, Meles Zenawi and others that were part of the previous regime were adherents of this policy approach and this ideology. The second is neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is an ideology and an approach that is being adhered to by Abiy Ahmed and those around him. And this ideology essentially says that the state need not have an activist role. Rather, it should not be active in the economy. The notion of laissez-faire economics is that the state should not intervene in the economy. To the extent it has a role, it's essentially in enforcing private property rights and the rule of law. That's essentially it. So even issues like market failures within the economy, there's not room for it within the prism of neoliberalism to deal with those issues. And so you liberalize and you privatize the economy and key elements of the economy, which is essentially what Ethiopia is doing today as we speak. And over the course of the last year, the adoption of neoliberalism through the IMF structural adjustment programs completely shifted Ethiopia's economic trajectory and economic model away from the developmental state to a neoliberal approach. As a consequence, as we've seen over the last year in particular, since the signing of that agreement in July 2024 with the IMF, we've seen significant changes in Ethiopia's economy, one that has shifted it to a much more liberalized and privatized economy. Some of the key features of this approach has been, for instance, trade liberalization. The trade sector needs to be liberalized. It needs to be, on one hand, open to foreign multinational companies. On the other hand, subsidies needed to be removed from the trade sector. Financial market liberalization is something that we're undergoing as we speak, opening the sector to foreign firms, while at the same time deregulating the financial sector. Privatizing state-owned enterprises, which is what we're seeing, cutting of government expenditure or government spending, even in really important areas like education, health, public infrastructure, etc. We see the Abiy regime has completely retrenched. It's no longer realizing public resources to invest in key sectors, and that's part and parcel of the austerity measures that the IMF is instituting on the Ethiopian state by and large. So when we take it all together, what we're seeing is the shrinking of the state, the shrinking of the public sector, and really it no longer having a meaningful, impactful role in the economy, which is the complete opposite of the developmental state model. Something that's really important to note is that developing countries, whether they were early developers, such as countries that are currently OECD countries, countries that are highly industrialized, developed countries, including the United States, much of Europe, including the United Kingdom, etc., they all, by and large, used a variation of a developmental state model to develop. They used infant industry protectionism. They protected their nascent infant industries until they were able to develop and compete. They also utilized tactics and strategies like tariffs to ensure they protect their domestic economy. They championed certain industries. They protected certain industries. They championed certain firms. They did this through strategic industrial policy, We see that they're even doing that today as we speak, right? If we're looking at industries of the future, in clean energy technologies and renewable energy, solar panels, wind turbines, renewable batteries, space exploration, and companies that are essential for space exploration. These are key sectors, key industries, and firms of the future. What we see is the United States, for example, is supporting actively through subsidies, financial support, through tariffs, protecting these industries. It's something that's very common, and frankly, it's something that is needed. If we look at recent developers, countries such as South Korea, countries such as China, Singapore, Taiwan, Vietnam, Japan, all of them were development state realizers. They were developmental state model. And so if we look at across the board, you have a certain approach to development. The importance of the state is really, really clear. It's essential. And yet, while Ethiopia had been on the right track, by and large, if there were certain impediments, if there were certain headwinds, taking corrective action makes sense. Part of industrial policy, part of a developmental state is making course corrections when there are challenges. China's really a quintessential example of how well-led, well-functioning state that effectively utilizes industrial policy can quickly develop as a country, as an economy. It can take people out of poverty. Over 1 billion people have been lifted out of poverty in China, and it can compete at the international stage. But it has to be done strategically. It has to be done with an activist role for this state. It needs to be led by subject matter experts. They need to be insulated from political pressure. There needs to be policy continuity, and there needs to be political will. The leadership must be all in this kind of a process. And so all that is to say is, unfortunately, part of the economic policy mismanagement and policy misprioritization that I've been speaking about is quite frankly all-encompassing. It's all-encompassing from the standpoint of the strategies that we're utilizing or the ideologies that the Ethiopian policymakers are now choosing to utilize, to the lack of investment, to the lack of productivity, and to the lack of strategic guidance of the economy. And so all that being said, it doesn't bode well, frankly, for the future outlook of the Ethiopian economy, which is something, again, myself and Dr. Elaling discussed in our last program. If we quickly look at policy approaches for Ethiopia over the last 20 years or so, this is also really important because during the developmental state-led model, there was policy continuity, there was strategic policy decision-making that linked the agricultural and the manufacturing sector. Initially, during the early 2000s, or even going back to the late 1990s, what we see is the principal focus was on agricultural development-led industrialization. The focus was on increasing the productivity of the agricultural sectors, significant investments in infrastructure, particularly in the rural areas, and then also trying to improve productivity of the agrarian sector. The policy approach is known as agricultural development industrialization. The key feature of that policy was the leasing of land. It was a highly contentious policy at the time, where the government leased huge tracts of land to multinational companies for long periods of time, anywhere between 30 to 100 years. And these multinational companies were expected to enter the Ethiopian agricultural sector with capital, financial capital, with equipment, machinery, inputs such as seeds, fertilizers, and to quickly engage in farming, commercial farming, large-scale commercial farming, with the hopes of improving the sector, with improving productivity and output. One of the contentious points that quickly arose is that was the production going to be for the export market or the domestic market? And that caused significant tensions because one of the key pillars of the policy was, on the one hand, to export in order to get foreign exchange earnings. On the other, it was to improve food security. Domestic food security issues in Ethiopia, as we know, are quite a challenge. And so that was one of the objectives as well. And these two aims or these two goals would come into conflict fundamentally. And that was one of the huge tensions of the policy, in addition to other issues that had to do with the allocation of land, the lack of transparency when it came to the contracts, issues between local communities and and companies that were coming into lands, issues with nomadic communities, etc. And then fundamentally part of the policy was also to improve the rural area beyond just agriculture. So the developing road systems, developing clinics, schools, the infrastructure system of that area was hoped that it would improve, it would develop. But by and large, that didn't happen, and that caused significant tensions between local communities and investors. Ultimately, what we can say is this policy delivered mixed results. However, there was a linkage that was made to manufacturing. One of the key pillars as that policy was being implemented and some of the challenges were arising, there was a recognition that there was a need to shift to manufacturing because of the labor, the low cost of labor, because a lot of the inputs that are needed for manufacturing were available in Ethiopia. And so there was a desire to integrate production from the agricultural sector into manufacturing, for instance, through things like agro-processing. Textiles and the inputs for textiles can be domestically sourced. Leather goods, as we know, shoes, bags, jackets, etc. Ethiopia has a significant livestock population, so the idea was to utilize that to feed into the manufacturing sector. It was well thought out. So the transition from an agricultural development industrialization approach to a manufacturing-led industrialization model. And that transition took place roughly around 2010, going up until 2018. I think there's a market departure, as I've been saying, after 2018 when Abiy Ahmed came into office, has ceased. That kind of policy continuity, strategic thinking, and pushing that agenda forward has completely ceased to humanity-oriented, unproductive approaches. So the manufacturing-led industrialization program focused on industrial parks or special economic zones. And these came online beginning in 2012, and roughly 19 special economic zones and industrial parks were built throughout Ethiopia, with some of the flagship projects being the one in Hawassa, the Hawassa Industrial Zone, as well as the Bole Lemi Industrial Zone on the outskirts of Addis Ababa. Essentially, the focus here was on the increasing productivity of the manufacturing sector. If we look at Ethiopia's manufacturing sector and its contribution to GDP, it's quite a sad story, because going all the way back to the 1990s, you see that it only contributes roughly 4 to 5% of GDP consistently. So it's a flat line at around 4 to 5% of GDP. That number needs to rise significantly. Countries like China, Vietnam, Indonesia, they've gone so far in terms of manufacturing value added to the economy and manufacturing's contribution as a share of GDP to the economy. Whereas our economy has been stagnant at about 5% for well over 30, 40 years. So the point was productivity of the sector needs to increase. As a consequence, there was also a desire to increase foreign direct investments into the sector. Broadly, this idea, this strategy was delivering results. One of the key data points worth looking at is, in addition to value-added production, which was increasing, was foreign direct investment in the sector. And at the apex of the policies, one of the highest points was in 2016, 2017, where foreign direct investments into Ethiopia was roughly $4.2 billion. Of that, 3.7 billion was in the manufacturing sector. And so significant multinational companies were investing in Ethiopia at this time. There was high hopes for this initiative, and major publications were calling Ethiopia the manufacturing hub of Africa, the next manufacturing hub of the world. This policy was delivering results. The policy ended up losing steam, losing support, political will when Abiy came to power. Again, Abiy went completely in a different direction. The country went towards active armed conflict. Civil war became rampant. Not only the civil war between 2020 and 2022, but the active civil war now that's taking place. Initially, the epicenter of the conflict was in Tigray region, also engulfing the Amhara region, Afar region. Now that the theater of conflict has shifted to the Amhara region, where there's still, over the last 2 years, active armed conflict. In my view, my characterization, it's yet another civil war. The theater of conflict has shifted, with the epicenter, but there's significant security challenges in the country. Amidst all of this, what has happened is the purchasing of armaments, equipments for war, the destruction of productive capacities, the lack of investments in productive capacities, and then the spending of resources and limited foreign exchange earnings on vanity projects. All in all, if we look at impact and results, particularly of the last 7 years, the Ethiopian economy is in free fall. The productivity of the economy has deteriorated. The growth, we look at things like GDP growth. Ethiopia had been known for robust GDP growth, double-digit GDP growth for over a decade. That has slowed significantly. Realistically, GDP growth in Ethiopia today is between 3 to 5%, down from the days of 8, 9, 10, 11, 12%. We also know that the birr is significantly depreciated. Right? Over the last year, the birr has been depreciated by over 140%. The purchasing power of the birr is weakened. As a consequence, the cost of living for citizens has increased and has become unbearable. We know inflation is still persistently high. Although the Abiy regime cites inflation at 10 to 15%, independent economists, both in Ethiopia and based abroad, put inflation at 40%. We also know foreign direct investments has been significantly reduced, both as a consequence of Ethiopia being removed from the African Growth and Opportunities Act, but also more broadly speaking, those that weren't even utilizing AGOA have started to leave the Ethiopian economy. So if we look at FDI as a percent of GDP, in 2016, 2017, FDI was 7% of GDP. Today, it's below 2%. So significant decline in FDI as well. Other key figures and data points we can look at, poverty has been increasing. UNDP has done a study showing that across every single region of Ethiopia, including the city-states of Addis Ababa and Direydawa, essentially across the map, poverty is increasing. Coupled with this report, UNDP and Oxford University have done a study on multidimensional poverty in Ethiopia, and that's also increased significantly. 73% of the Ethiopian population is considered to be multidimensional poverty. That's poverty across education, health, and income. And if we take those that are on the cusp of multidimensional poverty, we're looking at roughly 85 to 90% of the population being susceptible to multidimensional poverty or in multidimensional poverty. In addition to that, the US State Department recently released a report on the human rights conditions in Ethiopia, basically illustrating that things like rights and freedoms were in jeopardy, war crimes were rampant, extrajudicial killings, drone strikes against civilians were rampant, kidnappings and abductions have become essentially an epidemic. People are being kidnapped and abducted. There's been a deterioration of the rule of law, closing of civil society and civic space, deterioration in press freedom. And we also know there's been rampant political violence, including the killing and arbitrary detention of political opposition. So when we sort of take everything in context, we see a situation in which economic mismanagement, policy misprioritization has led to negative outcomes and a deterioration of the socio-economic conditions of Ethiopians. Easiest way of putting this is, are Ethiopians better off in 2018 or are they better off today? And I think the answer to that question is really, really straightforward. And then ultimately the question becomes, where is the Ethiopian economy going? My sense of it is that because the productive capacities haven't improved, because the structural balances haven't been addressed, the economy will continue to be in free fall, will continue to lead to deteriorating conditions, the lack of productivity, trade imbalances, payment imbalances, foreign exchange imbalances, labor market imbalances will all essentially continue. Coupled with the IMF structural adjustment programs, this will put significant burden on the Ethiopian population. Income and wealth inequality will continue to rise. All of this will disproportionately affect the least well-off in Ethiopia's society, which if we go by the multidimensional poverty index, that's anywhere between 85 to 90% of the population. And so this just makes for a combustible mix of issues, and we'll see where this goes. But corrective action is needed, change is needed, and the question ultimately becomes, what will the Ethiopian people choose to do? With that, I want to shift to the third topic, and that is the discussion that Dr. Arkebe Oqubay had with the Uganda Development Bank on industrial development financing, both in Ethiopia and Africa. This was a discussion that was held a couple of days ago. These conversations are meaningful, both from what I've outlined today, but also going forward. This isn't something that needs to be discussed. This is the kind of thinking, economic policy agenda setting that would take Ethiopia's economy forward and Africa's economy forward. And this is an individual who has been a key economic policymaker and minister, and who was an integral part of Ethiopia's economic transformation prior to 2018. So it's worth taking a listen. I hope you enjoy that conversation, that discussion, and the insights that emanate from that conversation. Thank you for tuning into this video, and we'll see you during the next one. Take care.
A level, it generates $8 billion from export services. It's a major policy instrument. So from industrial policy, a key for me is the political commitment. The political ambition is the starting point. The second point is putting all the effort on it. And I have to also remind, industrial policy is not only about comparative advantage. If you know how to shine a shoe now, it's not about that you specialize in that area. Industrial policy, in essence, is starting from what you have and to be able to reach where you want to be. And in some areas, industrial policy may succeed. In some areas, may not succeed. So in horticulture, we succeeded. And the focus was attracting productive FDI to the sector, especially from Holland. Holland is the main hub of floriculture, and we targeted them. And then the government provided extraordinary support, providing land freely, giving them incentives, and also expanding Ethiopian Airlines for air freight, and also making sure energy is supplied. And this all created and made Ethiopia, in about 10 years, one of the top 4 rose producers globally, next to Colombia, Kenya, among the leading countries.
And in the leather industry, what happened there?
In leather industry, the outcome were not successful. And this is mainly the government failed, or we failed, to develop the value chain, especially in livestock. Ethiopia has one of the biggest livestock developments, but it's based on smallholder farming. And it required a lot of political intervention and support. And on this area, also, we're not able to attract leading companies that can really be competitive in the export industries. So the central lesson, which is in my published book, Made in Africa, was that even though the government may have industrial policy as a guide, and with the same level of commitment, if you don't really take the policy decisions required, there may be some failures, but in some areas also there will be successes.
So you said that industrial policy is not about state interventionism. So what's the difference for you between state interventionism and the state being an active development actor?
Yeah, the difference is, as we all know, Soviet Union is a state-led economy, or a command economy, or socialist economy. We have seen that it failed as an economic model. So even in Ethiopia, we had a command economy led during the Derg military regime, which was entirely all economy and industries were nationalized. And Ethiopia recorded zero economic growth for 17 years after the end of the imperial regime. So this tells us it's not about state ownership. Industrial policy is primarily, first, you have to target strategic sectors based on clear criteria. what type of economy do you want to have? From our perspective, it has to be export-oriented. An economy that doesn't focus on international market, which is only limited in domestic economy, is not going to succeed. It has to focus on manufacturing and high-value goods and industries. And the support has to be concentrated and given. And also, the political economy context needs to be considered. And also, it requires a lot of learning. In many of the areas where we have been able to record successes is where we were able to study also lessons elsewhere. I want to pick one good example. In Africa, industrial zones or special economic zones have been built in the continent for maybe 50 years. The first initiatives were in Mauritius, export processing zone, in Senegal, Liberia, and then Nigeria. And Ethiopia did not have any single industrial park until 2010. Not a single one. And the first thing we said was, before we try to expand and replicate industrial zones in Ethiopia, we said we have to admit we don't have a very clear strategy and we have to study experience. So we studied the experience in this continent in depth in Nigeria and Mauritius. One successful, the other one mixed outcome. We also then saw the most successful industrial zones are in Asia. And in Asia, we studied South Korea, we studied Singapore, we studied Vietnam, we studied China and Taiwan. And based on this, we came up with a very clear strategy. And with this new model, we adapted. We didn't copy anything from one specific country. We then said we developed the legislative framework, institutional framework, and the industrial policy instruments required. Then we said we have to experiment. And we experimented with one special economic zone in Hawassa, which was built in 9 months, designing and development. We attracted the leading manufacturers from Asia already. And within 2 to 3 years, that single park created 35,000 jobs, which became the biggest industrial park. We expanded around the country. Now in Ethiopia, all initiatives started in the last 10 years. And Ethiopia has over 25 industrial zones and special economic zones. And we have all the industrial parks are sustainable or low carbon models. And this is critical also combining it with green industrialization. So this brings us back that industrial policy is about learning, about ensuring you benefit from latecomer advantage and not try to replicate what is done elsewhere as it is. So I want to highlight this because we Africans as latecomers, as we have to move on and use intelligently industrial policy because of the changing demography. We usually know by 2050, Africa will be 2.5 billion. But I want to give you a wider picture. By 2050, Uganda will have 100 million population. And by year 2100, it will have 140 million population. And the continent, Africa, will have 4.5 billion, where 40% of the world will be living in this continent. Where are the jobs for these young people? And where is the economy to be built? We need industrialization. We need high-value services sector. We need transformation of agriculture. And this can only be achieved when the government is extraordinarily focused, laser-focused on development agenda, ensuring high growth, mobilizing the whole private sector, and also, as today's theme is development finance, which is our agenda today. The development financing, we have all 3 members, is considered as the flagship of developmental state. Nothing can happen in industrial policy without development financing. So industrial policy is absolutely important, but we have to cater it to our reality and condition.
And it's great that you come to finance, because you've obviously been an actor during the days when ODA was quite popular in the early 2000s. And also you talked about the role of government, but your colleague Stefan Derkun spoke about Ethiopia as a success story, and he spoke about the grand bargain between the business and political elites to really drive that change. At the time, you had the support of a number of development partners from around the world. But as we know, the trends today are changing, and that finance is no longer available for many countries. At the same time, we've also seen the rise of some of our regional and continental champions. TDB is here, but also UDB as a national development bank. So how have things changed over the last 20 years for you, and how do we need to adapt? What do we need to do to our development finance organizations to be able to drive that growth in an environment that's structurally different to the one that when you were there with Mellers?
Yeah. In terms of development assistance, the first point I want to highlight is development assistance or donor support can only be helpful when the host country has a very clear policy, homegrown policy, and owns policies. Ethiopia has, in its history in the last 30 years, has been known in its past not accepting prescriptions of the Washington Consensus. We have many times fought against IMF. IMF instructed Mellers to open the bank, and he rejected. And Stiglitz put this in his book, which was the right policy. And IMF freezed assistance. And we also had in many cases where development assistance was freezed at different times because our policy were different from donor community. But we have seen also almost all donor community and also the international financial institutions, they wanted to work closely with Ethiopian government. And the logic they say is quite simple. They say when you go to Ethiopia, you talk with the policymakers, you will never reach an agreement in a very brief time. It takes a long time, and they insist on the policy they have prepared, and we have to fit to that. But once we agree, things move at speed of light and get implemented, and resources are not abused. And they say in some other countries, without naming, you will go and have a discussion, you reach an agreement quite fast, and things don't happen. So the key point here is the policy ownership has been quite critical, and the Ethiopian government always tries to see, it looks the resources available as a menu. And then we try to see how do we use in the best way of all these resources. For instance, World Bank funding, we mostly use it for road construction, because road construction is, its characteristics are easily manageable to deal with World Bank. When it's a very, very sensitive project, also, we try to depend on our own resources. We are not going to say organization X could not approve the lending on time. So we select for strategically sensitive, we try to mobilize our own resources, because sometimes also the donors or the financial institutions are not willing to support. A good example is the Grand Renaissance Dam, which is the biggest hydropower project in this continent, generating over 6,000 megawatt. So the World Bank was not willing to support us. China was not willing to support us. No one was willing to support because of the geopolitics. And the Ethiopian government decision was, we move forward with our own resources. And this project cost $7 billion, which was entirely mobilized by local resources from local banks, development banks again, from also bonds from the public, which was then implemented, which is going to be inaugurated next month. So the lesson is we have to tap all the donor assistance, what is available. And we have also to rely on domestic resources. And we should be also on a driver's seat, and we have to set the agenda. And many development partners like this approach because they know that their money is taxpayers' money, and they want to be sure also that the money is used wisely because the constituency also asks, demands that.
And so your latest project, or the last 2 years, I believe you've been focusing on greening economic development. So what's the opportunity there for the continent in terms of green industrialization? Or do you think it's a mix, like the energy mix, it should be a mixed approach as well?
Yeah, on the green industrialization, the first point we as Africans, we must look is it an opportunity or is it a liability or a penalty? Up to now, even among our leaders, African leaders, the discussion has focused about just transition. We need to be compensated based on the Copenhagen summit. We need to get 100 billion. And as we have seen, the reality is we are not going to get this money. It's just the wrong expectation. And on the other side, we have to look, the world is changing. The green transformation or the industrial revolution of the 21st century is moving rapidly. It's changing fundamentally. And this change is being led by green transformation, especially by China, who is now using renewable energy as an industry, EV in automotive industry, sustainable mobility, the whole transformation happening. And the 21st industrial revolution is going to be to combine both, to be led by green technologies and digital technologies, which means that the fossil oil, the fossil fuel economy is a legacy. We know that Trump is saying, drill, beautiful, drill. That's what he's saying. But it's a legacy economy. For us as Africans, we haven't yet industrialized. And the choice is, should we industrialize based on fossil fuel, which is not going to be sustainable, or should we be able to industrialize by building clean and based on new energy? The choice is ours. And our research extensively show, unquestionably, that Africa benefits from green industrialization. However, we have to be aware that the green transformation first has to combine two major components. First, economic transformation should be at the center. For us, green is not an end. We don't have any moral obligation. And second, we have to build carbon neutral economy. And the next question comes, every country has to adapt to its own reality. Nigeria's path is not going to be same as, let's say, South Africa. 80% of coal thermal power in the continent is attributed by South Africa. So it's a different type of economy. Nigeria is oil-based economy. And we know that Dangote is building one of the most sophisticated refinery and petrochemical, which needs to be encouraged. Africans should not be told to stop using our resources. But we have also to invest more on renewable energy. And a lot of positive things are happening now, according to our research. First, it's becoming a proof that 100% renewable energy based is feasible. And the best example is my home country, Ethiopia. Ethiopia's energy mix is 100% renewable, 100%. And it's a country that has been investing hugely in energy sector. Over $25 billion in the last 20 years has been invested in renewable energy, which means a low-income economy like Ethiopia can rely 100% on renewable energy. But secondly, also, we are seeing changes in the continent. In the last 5 years, we are observing a revolution in some economies. This is the expansion of solar energy is now a major departure in this continent, and development banks are playing critical roles. And I should mention 3 countries that are making some good breakthrough in this area. Egypt, Morocco, and South Africa are investing in solar energy. And the main reason is solar energy has now become, generating solar energy is cheaper than in coal energy. So the technology is benefiting, but a very clear pathway is absolutely important. And I'm sure Uganda will be able to show us also how to build carbon neutral economy. And Ugandan Development Bank, I'm aware that it also supports renewable energy and clean energy as one of the priority sectors.
Dr. Arkebe, I'm fully cognizant of the fact that I'm putting you under the sun and your renewable energy is burning right now. Would you like to move a little bit to the side? Sorry, I think this is better for you, no?
I like sunshine, so it's okay. I just came from London, so winter is ahead of us.
So I don't know if we want to take some questions from the floor. The president, I believe, is on his way. So, but we can take a few questions from the floor, maybe, if anyone wants to ask a question to Dr. Arkebe.
But I may also want to highlight a few things about this development financing issue because of the theme of this summit. First, I want to congratulate Uganda Development Bank for initiating this important summit. And they have to be applauded. I'm very, very optimistic that the development finance of Africa will grow by leaps. And among us are some of the leaders of this development finance, like CEO Admasu, who is here leading GDB and also South African development financing. What I want to highlight is, first, the African development finance has not developed much in the last 20, 25 years. The development finance in Africa accounts only for 2.5% of world development finance, only 2.5%. And I must tell you, the history of development finance or development banks started mainly after World War II. The oldest development bank in the world was established in 1830s, CDC, in France. But it was mainly after World War II that development banks started to develop, and also World Bank was established. And by year 2000, the total amount of money that is managed by development banks and DFIs reached 1.5 trillion for the first time. This was year 2000. And currently, this has reached $10 trillion. 10 trillion. Africa development finance amounts only 250 billion. And this is a continent that needs to catch up, that have to invest in infrastructure, that has to make massive investment in transforming its agriculture, in establishing many manufacturing plants, which means we have a lot to catch up. And the lesson is, when we talk about DFIs, it's not about state intervention. It's about primarily supporting the private sector, mobilizing resources, because the key feature of development banks is they, by using, let's say, $1, they will be able to mobilize $3 or $4 for which will be catered for development banks. And here the successes we see all over the world show us, and we have examples from Brazil, Bundesbank, which has almost $300 billion as asset. China Development Bank, which has an asset of 2.7 trillion, and the World Bank only half a trillion. And what we learn is, first, they have to be laser focused on strategic and priority sectors. That is what it makes them unique, because if it was all sectors, they are not different from commercial banks. But there is also an important lesson for us in Africa, that development banks have to operate commercially or near commercially. They should be able to provide long-term financing, and also with some subsidy of interest rate by focusing on strategic areas. But they have to be also world-class banks if they have to be successful, which means the government must also be disciplined. When many ask me about Ethiopian Airlines, which I had the privilege to lead the board for quite a long time, and the story of the success of Ethiopian Airlines, which is 100% state-owned, is the state has to be disciplined. The Prime Minister and the President must use the aircraft of Ethiopian Airlines, and when they travel, the Ministry of Finance must settle the bill every month. It's not a family business. So with development banks and development finance, the state, the government should appoint highly professional management board members that know the priority sectors, that know about banking. The leadership, the management team of the bank should be highly professional, selected the best ones. And then once the government gives a strategic priority, shouldn't intervene case by case. If it's not happy, it has to change the board. And this discipline will help the bank to be successful. And the best example in such discipline, which has now converted, earlier it was Development Bank, now has become commercial bank, is Singapore Development Bank, and also Development Bank of Mauritius are some of the best examples. So I would like the Ugandan government to strengthen Uganda Development Bank, DFIs, and show to the continent and to the world that a successful development bank can accelerate economic transformation, but also a sustainable banking industry.
Thank you, Dr. Arkebe. So a couple of comments. You said that Ethiopia was right not to open up its banking sector 10, 15 years ago. I think they are now opening up. Why was it the right decision not to open up 10, 15 years ago? And also, what are your thoughts on state-owned enterprises given the success of Ethiopian Airlines and the general consensus that the state is bad at running enterprises?
Yeah, this is a very good point. The first point is, here the critical issue, the agenda, central agenda is, how do we make the country accelerate economic transformation and catch up in the shortest possible time, in the most efficient, least painful process. This is the central agenda. So here, what you always try to look is, how do we mobilize the resources of the society, the private sector? When I say private sector, including productive FDI from abroad, as well as domestic industry, and to see also how not only the private sector, but the mass, like farmers, can prosper in that process. So the mystery is as follows. The intervention of the state is different from industry to industry. For instance, Ethiopian government approach to build textile industry has been to engage and mobilize productive FDI and give them the best incentive and attract targeted global manufacturers and leading buyers to this industry. Same with horticulture. While in the civil aviation industry, until year 2000, the only cement plant was owned by the government. And the sector was open for private sector, but private sector was not coming because it requires massive investment. After year 2000, the construction industry in Ethiopia was booming, cement demand increased, and many investors tried to come to the country. Locally as well, private sector became interested in that area. And 20 years back, 25 years back, cement output was 1 million ton, produced by one state-owned enterprise. Now there are 20 companies, 19 of them private sector, and the installed capacity is 20 million tons, times 20. Same thing in brewery. Existing breweries were in the 90s owned by the government, but they were successful. 3 big companies, highly productive, highly profitable. And then after year 2000, the government decided to privatize them. Many were privatized. And the government intention was not selling them because they were loss-making. They were very, very profitable. But the government's approach was the brewery industry was growing fast because the economy was growing 10.5% consecutively for many years, the fastest growing economy in the continent, 10.5%. And the farmers were earning more. And the first thing they would enjoy is they will not buy car. The consumption of sugar and brewery and maybe soft drink will be increasing. So the government wanted this market to expand. So these 3 were privatized, not even privatized to the local. They were privatized to the global leaders in the brewery industry. So they were privatized to Castile Group, Diageo, and Heineken. These are global leaders in the brewery industry. And the main point was the government wanted companies who want to make big investment, new investment, because the market was growing. It was has been the fastest growing brewery industry in the continent. And it worked. Now there are 30 brewing companies in the country, and the volume of brewery increased from 1.5 million hectoliter to about 15 million hectoliter. And we have to remember, this brewing industry, we have to look at the linkages. In industrial policy, a key concept is production linkage. On the forward linkage, they employ hundreds of thousands in the retail industry. On the backward, at the beginning, we're only importing malt barley from Europe. And the government did in parallel to attract the 3 largest and biggest malt barley producers in Europe. And we convinced it and we managed. Now they have established malt barley plants in Ethiopia. So the barley that was being imported is now being replaced by locally produced malt barley. And for this malt barley to operate, outgrowers, farmers producing barley, these factories were established near these valleys, and now they are supplying. So this brings us back to the point that the state plays strategic, but a catalytic role to make a real difference that growth can happen, production linkages can continue to grow, and also people's income can improve.
The sun seems to be following you, Dr. Arkebe.
That's okay.
So coming back to your role when you were mayor of Addis, today Addis is possibly the most transformed city on the continent. And for many years, it actually appeared quite chaotic. But today, it's sort of, you see the fruits of that effort. So what was your strategy there as a government and as city mayor? Was it a 5, 10, 15, 20-year plan? How did you make it happen? How did you guys transform that city?
Yeah, first, I should mention that I was the mayor in 2003. This is before 20 years. And have been privileged to be the best mayor in Africa and the second world mayor during my mayorship. And thank you. And when people ask me, because I have been in policy making and top leadership for over 30 years, when people ask me which job you enjoy, I always tell them the job I enjoy is not the job that I have been a minister or senior minister or special advisor to 3 prime ministers, but I say the best job I enjoy was the mayorship of city of Addis Ababa. And the main reason is, as a mayor, you cannot hide behind your desk. When there is a fire accident, you have to be there. When there are issues at the church, you have to be there. And you have to make a difference. And you get the reward immediately. If you transform the city, people will tell you that they are happy on the transformation of the city. So the precursor to this transformation was first, the government was convinced that the city was sleeping. Addis Ababa, by early 2000, it was a big village. A big village. It's not also a city with very, very long history. It was founded in 1990s, 1890s. It's 130 years old city. So it was a big village and nothing was happening. It was not an aspiring metropolitan city. So the first thing was the federal parliament endorsed a new charter of the city that gives power to the city, to the mayor, to transform the city. This was the first step. And then we had to make a major paradigm shift was essential. And this shift is, which I always emphasize, I give a lot of training to African mayors from time to time. And the key point is cities are not municipal service providers. Municipal service is okay, but the key is cities are economic players. Cities should be productive cities. They should be the ones who create jobs. They should be the ones who support small enterprises, medium enterprises. They should be the ones managing schools, technical and vocational education. They should be the ones key economic players, and they can transform. If we look at many global cities, they are the key contributors to the economy. Look at cities of London, cities of Paris. So this was a major paradigm shift. And the second point is cities have to be led by plans, city plan. A city without a city plan is going to be a chaotic city, especially when there is rapid growth. But in city planning, there are various also perspectives. You may put a very rigid city plan, but you may put a structural plan that will allow you to grow fast because you don't really know how the city will grow in due process. So the approach was to put structural plan, which is still up to now being followed by the city and which was endorsed by the city council, and that became the guide. And in many ways also we had to show changes. Previously, for instance, roads will start construction and they will be completed after 2 or 3 years. The new shift was a road construction, if it starts, it has to be completed in 3 to 4 months. Construction should be continued 24 hours, 7 days. And the main reason is when there is road construction in the city, all businesses die during that period of construction. Utility, water, electric. So the residents faced many, many challenges. So this was a change. And in our concept also, when roads were built, only the lanes for cars will be built. What about the lane for the people, for the city residents? This was a major shift. So from every road, when built, should have enough pedestrian road. And even if it's not enough, you have to narrow down the car lanes so that pedestrian can have their own lanes. And then the next point was, what major projects should we launch? How do we select them? And the clear criteria was, we have to select activities we need to support that will affect the lives of the majority. And the key priority, for instance, was for us, expansion of schools. So when I was the mayor, in 18 months, we managed to construct 5,000 classrooms fully equipped with furnitures, completed in 18 months to end multiple shifts in schools. The case was there were 700,000 students in the city. 700,000 means a city by itself. And mothers have to take the kids to the school because it was multiple shift. They will take them at 8:30 or 9 a.m. and then they will take their kids back at 12 o'clock or 12:30. And they have to stay home because they have to watch the kids. And we said, this is affecting the lives of women. Women cannot be deployed in jobs. So we changed it to a full day school. We trained thousands of teachers. We built all these classrooms, and we made sure a full day education was implemented. And the key was it was women who were liberated because now they can go to full day jobs because the kids are in schools. Then we had to start initiative of a major housing program, which is considered as one of the most successful experience by UN Habitat. And this was an integrated housing development programs. The city needed 700,000 residential houses. And people were not investing in houses because the military regime, the DERG, had nationalized all houses. So people do not have a dream to even to own houses. So we said if we have to build to address the housing issue, we have to address it in a way that it will generate wealth. This was central point. So what we did was we developed special program. It's a public housing program. What we didn't want to copy social housing program in UK or Germany or France, where social housing is built and then rented. We built a housing program with a different model that houses will be built. They will be passed to city residents. They will pay 10 to 15% only as down payment, and then 85% or 90% was arranged as financing for them. And when we give these houses also, the houses will be given based on lottery or to those who do not own houses. And we also came in line with the city plan. Addis Ababa follows a compact city plan. So we developed a new condominium houses with multi-floors to save land. And we subsidized infrastructure and land. And we put in the legislation. In lottery, the first 30% of the houses will be given only to women, the first round. So if there are 10,000 houses, 3,000 will only be available for lottery among women. Second round, all will be participating, including the women will be participating. So we made sure that they get 60% of all houses. And this was not, this has its own reason. We saw in the city, there are many single moms who are responsible for the family. And they are the ones also who save money. And they are the ones who are responsible for the kids. And we made sure in the legislation that women at least will be able to get about 60% of this housing program. And then we combine this with employment creation. We combine this with development of construction industry. And we also combine this with reducing slums. These houses were built within the city, not in the periphery. So this was one of the flagship projects. What I want to say is, to highlight in conclusion, one is we have to consider cities as key productive players. And secondly, we have also to focus on intervention that will really make a difference in transforming the lives of the majority of people. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So the president is about to arrive, so we've only got a few more minutes. But in terms of the, in terms of financing, you said you subsidized the housing. You also provided sort of mortgages for 85% of the value of the housing. So which institutions were doing that? Was it the National Development Bank? Was it the government? Was it with the support of ODA? What was the financing structure there?
the financial structure we developed that time was, for instance, like housing, the school construction program was entirely financed by the treasury of the city, not even the central government, by the city. We put it as a priority. To put it as a priority, you need to follow austerity in other programs. So what we did was we freezed all municipal offices. The municipality had 40,000 workers, employees. So the first thing, we freezed employment of new staff, overhead. We freezed buying cars. We freezed building offices. We made sure that no money is spent in unproductive activity, so that the productive activity could be financed. And this is the way. If you think it's priority, you start by spending your own money, not looking at donor money. The second point on the housing program, it's a 20-year, 15-year, 25-year mortgage program. So we had to negotiate with the Commercial Bank of Ethiopia to arrange these loans, which they happily agreed because they had a lot of money. So it was arranged with Commercial Bank of Ethiopia, and in the Ethiopian banking industry context, the commercial bank, although its name is Commercial Bank, it's the biggest bank. All banks combined do have assets less than CBE. So Commercial Bank is involved in financing, for instance, power generation, financing industrial zones and various activities. So for housing, it was mainly arranged with them. But the city also was quite active approaching donor community, and we involved them in upgrading some slums and also ensuring that support is given where there is a need for humanitarian assistance. And all the donors were closely working with the government. So we had to follow that model. Then we also introduced measures to increase tax. And the way we did was, after 1 year, we doubled the revenue of the city. Not by forceful measure, but we discussed among city residents. We designed a new system. Earlier, the tax revenue agencies will try to collect money going house to house. And we said we have to stop this. So we came with an arrangement with all banks, because we want also city residents to use banking service so that they will be able to save. So we sat with the banks and we designed a system that people can go and pay through the banks. And we also extended the outlets, which really helped to expand revenue as well. So improving revenue incomes was also part of a strategy.
So is this why the banking sector was strategically important, and why we shouldn't have opened up to the to external investors or to the outside world?
No, actually, this was the policy we followed at city level. But the point is, all banks at some point will have to open. But even when you open banks, there are different policy measures you need to follow. The first one is, are the local banks strong enough to cope with the competition? This is a key concern. Even now, as the government negotiated with IMF on opening of banks, this is a major challenge. The local banks should be strong enough and should be merged to some extent that they can still compete. Because the purpose is not killing local banks. The purpose is to mobilize new resources, to bring new dynamism, to come up with innovative financing. So this is one key aspect. But in the government's approach has been consistently, it also has been tapping international capital market as well. For instance, Ethiopian Airlines uses, for all buying of aircrafts, 55% of the money comes from international capital market. And all banks want Ethiopian Airlines to borrow because they know it's a profitable business. And also, the government has been tapping Eurobond as well, but also tapping concessional loans from many development banks, including EIB and then Development Banks Consortium from Europe, from China, from India, Exim Bank. So it also combines all these different type of financial institutions.
Okay, and my final question comes back to national development banks, regional development banks, because I know that in Ethiopia a couple of years ago, when the country was facing some currency issues, some foreign currency issues, the only people that actually stepped up to the challenge were the likes of Afrexim Bank and Trade and Development Bank. So really having strong regional and national development banks will be key in the future, especially with regulation that seems to be changing and penalizing the continent, penalizing through capital controls, capital requirements, and therefore we've seen the retreat of international banks. So what's your take there in terms of making sure that we have these strong regional and national development banks?
Yeah, having the three layers of development finance institution is quite important. First, I want to clarify the distinction between development banks and DFI, development financial institutions. When we talk about development bank, we are talking like African Development Bank or Ugandan Development Bank. And then we have development finance institution, which may also include sovereign wealth, pension funds, different type of funds that can be used for public investment. So the first thing is at national level, African countries should aim to have a development bank or DFIs, and this is strategically important. They cannot rely on continental or regional development banks because the demand is so high, and the development bank, one of its tasks is to mobilize resources and to channel to priority sectors. So they need this bank at national level. And here a relevant experience like Brazil's Bundesbank or Mauritius Development Bank or IDC from South Africa will be relevant. The second is we also need a regional banks, development banks like TDB, like African Development Banks, because they have a leverage. They are owned by shareholders, different governments being shareholders. Also many international banks and international institutions are members. They feel more comfortable investing in these regional banks because they are, the risk is limited. So we need this type of DFIs. And at third level also, we need to go beyond the continent, and which includes like World Bank, like EI, European Investment Bank, or like Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, where many African governments, including countries like Ethiopia, Egypt are members. New Development Bank, we have to tap all these type of banks. And on the regional banks, I want to emphasize currently the capital structure they have is very, very limited. African Development Bank asset is very limited. TDB's asset is very limited, which means that they will not be able to finance major infrastructure projects. They will not be able to finance or fund investment that is required across countries. For instance, we need to connect the continental grid system, has to be connected. Power needs to move among countries. The ICT infrastructure, telecommunication infrastructure needs to be developed across the continent. And railways need to be built across countries. These require a lot of investment, and which means that they have to expand their capital bases. And to my understanding, one of the new approaches that the African Development Bank is going to follow with the new leadership is to tap significant resources from other DFIs, but also to synergize its expertise by using these sub-regional development institutions like TDB also to be strengthened, because it will limit the effectiveness and operation of African Development Bank if it only operates on its own. So it has to combine synergy between these. And the demand is quite significant. Annually, we need for infrastructure in Africa, a minimum conservatively $150 billion. This is every year. And this is quite significant commitment. So I think we have a huge challenge building the national development banks, the regional DFIs, ensuring not only their capital base is strong, but also their operational efficiency is world class. There is a lot of money. The total money sitting globally is around 400 trillion that needs investment. But this investment or this money looks to the most profitable and the least risky investment. And the role of these development banks is they become an important player in de-risking the process, in mobilizing, in financing. They become a truly catalyst for the supporting these development initiatives. So I look, I mean, national banks cannot be substituted. They are important, but we also need the continental and sub-regional development banks. We also need to tap the multilateral organizations, but we have to understand, for instance, World Bank is one of the oldest DFI, one of the oldest banks, development bank. When we say about development bank, we look at state-owned banks, but the World Bank itself is owned by governments, but the problem has been its capital asset has not expanded. It's still 500 billion, while the global economy has now expanded, especially developing and emerging economies have expanded. But the World Bank is still in its small size, inadequate support to all developing countries. So we need to complement with all these processes.
Dr. Arkebe, it's been a slightly longer chat, but very insightful. Thank you for your expertise, your knowledge, your insights. Anyone's interested to read more, Dr. Arkebe has released a number of books and papers, including a 1,000-page book on greening industrial policy or greening industrialization. So a warm round of applause to Dr. Arkebe. We're going to have the official opening now, and then we'll go back into the main hall for panel discussion with Masud Addis. He'll be able to respond to your call for a greater capitalization of his bank and others. And also, we've got the former Deputy Prime Minister of Zimbabwe and a technology AI expert who's just released 2 books, Professor Arthur Mutambara. We've also got from Danida, Adam Spire-Split, and Dr. Monique Nzanza Baganwa, the former Deputy Chairperson of the African Union, in our plenary and panel discussion immediately following the opening. So, Dr. Mitch, I'll give you the microphone, and you can tell us the official run-off show for the next 40 minutes or so.
Thank you very much.
Before you leave, let's give a round of applause to Omar and Dr. Arkebe. Just out of curiosity, Omar, the majority of us were really spellbound by the presentation and the fireside chat, and we realized with great concern that there was one key element that was lacking in this discussion, is that we didn't have a chance to get in on the action. What can we do to be able to ask questions and participate? I know the president is imminently coming in. What do you think we'll be able to do? Because I'm sure so many people are itching to ask questions.
Take the microphone around.
I think, do you mind as we wait for the president, do you mind if we engage? You can see hands are coming up already. So I think let's start here.
Thank you very much. My name is Victoria Sectorico from the Uganda Good Business Alliance. But before I say anything, can Dr. Tadesse get a bottle of water? It is hot. He's been talking all this time. Thank you very much for sharing. And just to make it easy, I worked in Ethiopia for 3 years, so I have a rough idea about Ethiopia. They have got so many pieces of livestock. There are more livestock than people in Ethiopia. So that is where my interest is. He told you about the successful stories, Ethiopian Airlines and the horticulture, but he said leather did not work. Because given the fact that Uganda is very interested in leather right now, I would like to request you to please elaborate so that Uganda can benchmark and know what not to do and maybe what to do in order to leapfrog. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable.
Yeah.
I'll allow you to answer the question so that just in case that question is done.
I will give a quick answer. Actually, I have been in Kampala a few weeks back, and one of the industries I tried to study and to learn was your dairy industry. And I must tell you, it's one of the most success stories in this continent. Uganda now produces annually 5 billion liters of milk. And this is linked, supported with the valleys of this milk production, linked with processing. And the big challenge has been exporting this milk because of the long logistics challenge of the road transport and not yet fully the railway completed. But this is from my knowledge of many African countries, this is a success story that Uganda can contribute. And we have seen that dairy industry can develop the way Uganda has been able to do. And I know that I'm aware Kenya has been trying to do that earlier, but now Uganda has excelled. And also South Africa was producing much milk, but now it doesn't reach the volume of Uganda. And I was wondering, maybe because His Excellency President Museveni loves also the cattle and the cows. I really mean he has been championing as an example because he is also in a way a farmer who has a strong linkage with the cows and the dairy industry. But this is one of the most successful stories which we'll be researching more so that policy lessons could be given.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, the laser is, the mystery about laser is, it requires quite a different approach. Now what is happening is, laser originally was used for shoe and for jacket and for bags. Now with the new synthetic technology, if you look around, sneakers are no more laser products. And now synthetic is produced even to substitute laser products. So this is one element. The cost margin of leather products is diminishing from time to time. The second point is you can only become successful in leather if you become a meat producing country, because you don't slaughter cattle to get leather. Leather is a byproduct of that. So it has to be aligned with meat exports. And this is a very critical point. So what I want to highlight is the industrial structure of leather is changing in many fundamental ways. And now there is also a movement that vegetarian, that meat is being produced in laboratories, substituting cattle being considered as generating high greenhouse emission. So I think there are many aspects we need to look at, and this requires looking at the specific country's condition. Do you know the biggest exporter of leather in the world? Huh? Argentina? No. The biggest exporter of leather is United States. They are not exporting the hides and skins as export, but since they consume a lot of meat, they just export it, including export to China. So there is quite interesting economics in that sector.
Thank you very much, Honorable Victoria, for your question. Thank you very much, Dr. Arkebe. I think for for equal opportunities, we'd like to give boy child also an opportunity, because the girl child seems to be taking a lead, but it's all right. Let me hand over to you.
Hello, good morning. Lynn Gitu from the Global Environment Facility funded Planet Gold Project. Thank you, Dr. Arkebe. I want to talk about the mineral sector. So it's probably one of the most strategic sectors on the continent. And about 80%.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think we'll have to close the session. His Excellency is imminently arriving. Give a round of applause to Dr. Arkebe and to Omar. Kindly take your seats.